And it's great to be here. I guess I'm well qualified now to speak on this panel because my role at the Pentagon was sort of as a small, minor internal insurgent force. So I'm well qualified to speak about counterinsurgency, having had the opposite experience. What I want to do is I'm going to start by picking on Sebastian and explain a few small areas where I think he is wrong. But then I'm going to explain some larger areas where I actually think he's quite right, that have profound implications for how we think about the rule of law and counterinsurgency. So first the quibbles. I certainly think that Sebastian is quite right, that the world is not necessarily more complex than it's ever been before. The world's always a complicated place. I do think that lethality is more far-flung, democratized, widespread, and complex. The quarters from which threats capable of taking out very large numbers of people very, very quickly have increased. The speed of lethal action has increased. Mass lethal action has increased. This is not news to anybody, but I think that's sort of the backdrop for us is not so much perhaps complexity as such, but that unpleasant combination of the democracy, the democratization of the means of, if not mass, very widespread destruction, coupled with the particular forms of complexity that we're now facing. And that does indeed drive the need to make some very hard choices. I would somewhat, I don't know, disagree necessarily, but recharacterize the issue of how do we conceptualize our national interests right now and what the greatest threat to our national interests is. I very much agree with Sebastian that, and I'll just say more about this in just a few moments, that the fact that Al-Qaeda has a global and religious ideology is extremely important in how we counter Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and one that we do tend to underestimate often on the ground, I think. But at the same time, I think that in the global context and the context of the Muslim world more generally, Al-Qaeda has been doing some of our work for us. I think one of the most heartening things for probably, I think, for everybody in this room, as we've looked at the so-called Arab Spring, has been the degree to which Al-Qaeda seems to have done an excellent job of increasingly discrediting and marginalizing itself in the Arab world. No question, I also at the Pentagon, in addition to my role on rule of law issues, I had the unfortunate task of leading the Pentagon's I.O. and strategic communication reform efforts and defending our information operations budget before Congress and trying to get them to restore several $100 million of funds that they wanted to cut. There's no question but that we could do better in the information operations world. We could do better if we had more money. We could do better if we had a greater ability to be creative. But that said, luckily for us, unluckily for many civilians, particularly in the Muslim world, Al-Qaeda's strategy, well, if you can call it that, of killing tremendous numbers of Muslim citizens has done more than probably anything we could have done, or certainly anything more than we could have said, to undermine them within those regions of the world. And one of the things that was most striking to me about the television and newspaper reports on the crowds in Egypt, the crowds in Tunisia, et cetera, was how irrelevant Al-Qaeda was to the protesters, how irrelevant Al-Qaeda was to those discussions. Sebastian, offline conversation, noted that this doesn't mean that everything is joy and happiness by any means in that part of the world. We're seeing a resurgence of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and I'll say again more about this later, I would actually much rather find ourselves dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood or indeed Hamas or Hezbollah than Al-Qaeda for some reasons that I'll come to. Let me talk about why Sebastian's right in some very fundamental, important ways, though. I think that if you think about what is fundamental to counterinsurgency doctrine, the idea, it's built on a recognition of complexity and paradox, and yet at the same time, I think Sebastian is right to note that perhaps the field manual draws on a relatively narrow range of cases from which it draws perhaps an overly broad set of conclusions which are not as universally applicable to countering insurgencies as we might like to think. E.g., it tends to overlook the quite deep differences that have to do with whether you are trying to counter an enemy that is fundamentally nationalistically motivated by ideas of self-determination, by anti-colonialist ideology, or a group that is fundamentally motivated by a kind of global ideology. Whether it happens to be religion or whether it happens to be global communism really doesn't necessarily matter. Why are these things different? Well, it's going to have a very profound impact on what it is these groups are looking for and how much they care about things like local or international legitimacy, which in turn is going to have a very profound impact on how successful certain kinds of actions by us are going to be. I think that the whole idea of best practices, which everybody loves to make fun of, we probably should indeed bar it, get rid of the term, replace it with crucial questions rather than best practices, since the term best practices itself tends to mislead us into thinking that we've got a set of lessons that will be, that A, we have actually learned, which is rarely the case, but the B, that we can neatly apply across the board in all sorts of settings, as opposed to a set of questions that we really better ask ourselves very seriously, no matter where we are. So let me talk about what some of those crucial questions might be in the context of counterinsurgency and rule of law. And that first question, well, what do the bad guys want? What do our enemies want? Sounds like a obvious one, but I think this gets to the point Sebastian made earlier. If what your enemy wants, if what the insurgents want, is to become the legitimate and internationally recognized government of a legitimate and internationally recognized state, then some strategies that are at the root of coin doctrine make a tremendous amount of sense. Countering them by saying, no, the government is more legitimate, can do a better job of establishing the basic institutions of law and order, building capacity. That makes a lot of sense. That's a very sound strategy. You force then the insurgents to compete on your terrain. You force them to try to become more legitimate. You draw them into sort of a web of discourse about who is better at providing services, who is better at being legitimate, et cetera. That's a good thing. You want to do that. Then you either beat them militarily, or it becomes irrelevant because they become sufficiently forced to use the political system, use courts, use elections, use international fora in a way that renders their danger much less to us. But what if the entities that you are trying to combat really could care less about international legitimacy, or indeed even local legitimacy? It's quite clear that Al-Qaeda really doesn't care what the United Nations thinks of it, what the European Union thinks of it, what the WTO thinks of it, what the United States thinks of it. Al-Qaeda also doesn't really care what citizens of Afghanistan or Iraq think of it either. It's not particularly clear that Taliban cares a whole lot more about any of these things. Clearly, we already know that the Taliban has zero interest in international legitimacy. They quite happily, happily for them, briefly, enjoyed a period in which they were recognized by only 2 or 3 states on Earth. Didn't much bother them, as far as we can tell. They readily ignored pleas, dictates, demands, et cetera, from across the international community and the region itself prior to 2011. It's not, in fact, all that clear how much they care or how consistently they care, at any rate, about achieving local level legitimacy. They sometimes seem to care, and sometimes their on-the-ground tactics suggest that they care in things like their own version of the provision of justice. But they don't always seem to care. And what happens then, if it turns out that the enemy that we're facing doesn't actually want, my question was, what does the enemy want? If they don't want legitimacy as we understand it, if they're looking at legitimacy in the eyes of God or legitimacy in the eyes of future generations rather than legitimacy in the eyes of either a local population, a regional population, or a global population, then a lot of the things that we might try to do against a very different kind of enemy will not necessarily be successful. In fact, we're going to face a particularly painful paradox, one I think we are facing in Afghanistan right now, which is, of course, that the minute we announce population-centric warfare, which in our case does not mean making war on the population, but means protecting the population, building up institutions that will serve the population, specifically in the rule of law arena, building the capacity of host nation legal institutions, governance institutions, et cetera. Well, guess what? We've just created a nice fat bunch of new targets for our enemy, because we've said our measure of success will be dependent on how much we succeed in building up these institutions. Well, thank you. now I know who to go after, and I'm going to go assassinate judges, and I'm going to go blow up courthouses, and I'm going to go do my darndest to threaten, kill anyone who has any engagement in that system. And we've obviously seen that happening, and that I think is a very painful conundrum for us. And I don't think it has an obvious solution, although I think I'll try to tease out some potential implications of that in a moment. And this is probably you could put it a little differently. We're playing a very different game from we, the United States, we, NATO, we, the international community. We're playing a very different game than Al-Qaeda or the Taliban is playing. We are indeed playing the classic state-building, nation-building game. They're not. They're playing a totally different game. And if we keep thinking of winning our game, we may never win against them. This is probably as good a place as any to say something about the used, overused, and abused idea of lawfare. The criticism sometimes from the political right of the use of international law and institutions to challenge some of the US practices in the context of Afghanistan, or the war on terror, interrogations, detention-related, et cetera. It seems to me that we should be so lucky if Al-Qaeda itself or the Taliban itself were to engage in so-called lawfare. Because again, go back to my point about seeking international legitimacy and what game are we playing. If they were actually doing that, that would be a good thing, because that would be part of drawing them into caring what the international system thinks of them, which at the moment, as far as I can tell, they don't. And that indeed is part of what ultimately a successful counterinsurgency strategy tries to do, right, is draw the bad guys into a web of institutions and systems that forces them to gradually put aside violence and turn to more legitimate means of gaining power. So not happening. Actually, if it were, it would probably be a good sign, not a bad sign. So let me ask question 2, crucial question number 2. I said crucial question number 1, what do they want? Crucial question number 2, what do we want? And here again, I think Sebastian's quite right that this starts with national interests and has to be very, very hard-nosed. If the answer to what we want is we want peace and harmony throughout the world, we want Afghanistan to look kind of like Sweden, et cetera, we want to save the whales too. That's nice, right? But not very helpful. That I think that we need to really sharpen, both in the context of global strategy, but also in the context very specifically of a place like Afghanistan. We need to really sharpen the idea of we want, which gets to crucial question 3, very closely related, I think should be very closely related to question 2, which is what can we do? And when we ask question 2, what do we want, without asking question 3, what can we do, then we get a bunch of really stupid answers to question 2, right? If we're not thinking about our capacities, if we're only thinking about our ideals and our aspirations, then the answer to what we want becomes unreachable. We can't ever get there. It's meaningless to say that we want peace, democracy, and harmony in Afghanistan, and that we want all of our troops out in 6 months, and that we want it to be cheap, and that we want it to be all these other things and help everybody win elections and so on. Can't do all of those things. There are probably some subset of much smaller things that we can do, but we need to match our understanding of our aspirations to a very hard-nosed understanding of our capabilities. And what can we do? Question 3, what can we do? Not as much as we think when it comes to stability operations and counterinsurgency. We don't know that much. We don't know the languages. We don't know the culture. We don't know the geography is what we know more than we knew 8 years ago, but to be sure, but we still don't know that much. The money is not infinite. The resources are never there as much as we want them to be. The political will is never enduring. It's extremely fickle, as we know. It will always be fickle, saying, well, what we really need is sustainability of resources and sustained political will. That's nice too. I want that too, but we're not going to get it in our political culture in our lifetimes. It's not going to happen. We're going to go places. The email won't work. The phones won't work. The cars won't work. The roads will be bad. We can't do that much. And I think we consistently underestimate this. We've got people on 1-year deployments, 6-month deployments, 18-month deployments. Not long enough, but we can't do more. So there's not that much that we can do. So question 4, do our ideals sometimes drive us again, a big paradox to engage in behavior that actually undermines those ideals, that our ideals of achieving democracy, achieving human rights, achieving the rule of law, end up embroiling us in situations where the more and the longer we stay, the worse things are, the more arbitrary we behave. I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves, and sometimes the answer becomes yes. Question 5, returning to question 2, what do we want? So now we have the question, so what do we really want, given all of that? Or what should we really want? What should we really strive for when it comes to counterinsurgency and rule of law? And what does this all mean? And here I think that we do need to be much more modest. We need to be more ruthlessly self-protective, more focused on the sort of hard-nosed, what is the bare minimum acceptable situation for us in which our core national interests are no longer threatened in a significant way, recognizing that we'll never eliminate all threats. And this, in fact, I think does lead us back to some of the foundational paradoxes of coin doctrine, if you will, which having sort of critiqued some aspects of coin doctrine, I think are nonetheless vital, no matter what issue we're thinking about, which is that we need to learn to tolerate mess. We need to learn to accept the good enough rather than the perfect. We need to adopt a sort of modest and do no harm approach to rule of law, as well as to other kinds of governance and economic development projects. We need to recognize that sometimes doing nothing is doing something, that having other people, as they say, do things tolerably well is often better than having us do them well, even if we could, which often we can't, and that tactical success doesn't guarantee anything. And I think that that leads you to a very different mindset, whether you want to think about these issues at the strategic level or at the extremely tactical level. It leads you at the extremely tactical level to sort of thinking not about programs that would do a tremendous amount of good if you could fund them and sustain them for 10 years. It leads you to think instead about, let's imagine that we only have the money and the political will to do this for 6 months or a year. What, if anything, would still be useful if expanded after that? And that's a very different way to think about these problems than I think the way that we still unfortunately do. So I'll stop there, more questions and answers, and turn it over to Phil, who can answer them all.
There you go, you have your job assignment.
Yeah, always the tough law professor. Thanks, Rosa.
It's the Socratic method.
Right, and I think I want to turn the title of the conference a bit on its head, and instead of talking about the rule of law in coin, talk about the role of law in warfare. And I want to start by touching on something that Rosa mentioned about lawfare, which has been a subject that's been debated a lot in political circles and legal circles that we travel in. But it's essentially the idea that instead of waging war by military means, you would wage war by other means, particularly by legal means. And it made its way into a Pentagon strategy document in 2006, the National Defense Strategy, where the authors wrote that we should be fearful of adversaries, particularly non-state actors, that seek to use international fora and judicial processes against the United States, that these are tools of these weak actors to wage asymmetric war against the U.S. I agree, we should be so lucky, but that this was an argument against using law in war. More recently, we've heard arguments from various parts of the political spectrum against using law in war when we deal with terrorists, when we deal with people like Khaled Sheikh Mohammed or Ahmed Galani or Umar Abdul Muttalib, the Christmas Day bomber, that we should use a military approach to these individuals. We should detain them at Guantanamo, and we should prosecute them at Guantanamo, and we should do so to the exclusion of civilian courts, the exclusion of civil law processes. And I want to argue today to you that both arguments get it wrong. Both arguments get it wrong because they ignore the role that law can play and should play and does play in warfare, and they effectively amount to unilateral disarmament by the United States because they discard a tool, a weapon, an element of our national power, that the law is an element of national power and that we should seek to use it and leverage it and act within it as much as we can. So in this 21st century conflict, in this war against al-Qaeda, the law is an element of national power that we can wield effectively and probably more effectively than other elements in a lot of cases. So I want to briefly go through the sort of trichotomy that we talk about a lot in the military of strategic, operational, and tactical to understand how this works, how the law functions in this way. Well, I mean, to say it's an element of U.S. power is sort of it's like a self-licking ice cream cone. It's very circular. the law is an element of power to the extent that we have a comparative advantage in this field. We have ideals, interests, structures, institutions that are admired around the world, and this system, this legitimate, transparent, accountable system of law is one that we can leverage for strategic gain. It is also a type of power that enables other types. By working through legal means, by working through legal processes, you enable diplomacy, you enable the use of economic power, and you enable the use of military power too. And it's consistent with who we are. So strategically, this element of power complements and fits with the others and enables them in a way that's very important. Operationally, I think law works better than a lot of other tools. And it particularly works better in the kinds of wars amongst the people that we now see ourselves fighting. The counterinsurgency campaign globally that we are waging, or the counterterrorism campaign globally, puts a premium on legitimacy, transparency, accountability, precision. And the law achieves these goals in a very important way. Just to run through a few examples of operational modes that have used the law as an element of power. The Justice Department's counterterrorism prosecutions have incarcerated approximately 400 individuals over the last 10 years. These are terrorists who have been arrested by local police or the FBI, brought into federal court, and then, for the most part, put the rest of their natural lives in federal prison in Terre Haute or Florence, Colorado. An extremely effective mode of removing combatants from the battlefield while simultaneously gathering information from them, disrupting, dismantling, and defeating networks, and doing so in a transparent and effective manner. A few that are not so well known and not so widely talked about, the Treasury Department and Justice Department sanctions on Libya that were brought in, I think, February or March, took out the Libyan treasury, removed $36 billion from Gaddafi's ability to wage war, effectively depriving him of a way to gather weaponry, raise armies, and fight against NATO on the battlefield. Extremely effective use of lawfare. U.S. export controls and sanctions, another use that relies on international institutions, but also relies on a combination of economic sanctions, federal criminal and civil litigation, and regulations to effectively block certain material from going to a place or shape the battlefield environment for other modes of operation and other modes of strategic action. Criminal prosecutions, a huge way that the U.S. wages asymmetric warfare in its own right. So when you think about the way that a non-state actor might wage lawfare, they may file a plaintiff's lawsuit against Secretary Gates or Secretary Panetta. They may file some sort of another action. But when the state goes into court and prosecutes someone, or the state goes into court and alleges that someone has leaked, that's a much more effective and, in a lot of ways, a much more powerful use of the law than these non-state actors could ever hope to bring. And so to call this a threat to the U.S. is really mistaken, because, if anything, this is an opportunity. This is a place where the U.S., particularly the U.S. government, has an enormous advantage. And then last, and I want to save this for Al, are all the things we do abroad to promote the rule of law. And these are the things we've done in Iraq to build legal institutions such as the police, the courts, the prisons, the civil society institutions, the things that Al's done in the last 2 years in Afghanistan to promote the rule of law, the things that we've successfully done in Haiti and Bosnia and Kosovo and throughout Eastern Europe, oftentimes working through civil society partners that have only a tangential connection to the U.S. government. These are extraordinarily effective tools, and to say that we should deprive ourselves of these tools, that we should not use law in war, again, strikes me as being tantamount to unilateral disarmament. And last, tactically, law enables and reinforces successful counterinsurgency practices and really successful military practices. One of our colleagues at the University of Virginia, a guy named Tom Nachbar, has done a great deal of research and writing in this area. And one of the things he said to me, based on his research one time that's stuck, is that over time, if you look at successful military operations, one of the common denominators is that they comply with the laws of armed conflict. And it's not because they want to be nice, and it's not because they want to adhere to the Geneva Convention, although there are some real benefits to discipline and effectiveness that flow from that. It's because of the nexus between the laws of armed conflict and targeting and precision of action and economy of force that the act of complying with the laws of armed conflict and disciplining your force to do so serve other tactical and operational objectives and reinforce your ability to hit those objectives. Distinction in the law of armed conflict, the idea that you would distinguish between civilians and combatants on the battlefield, is extremely important. It's also the close cousin of precision and targeting. If you're distinguishing in an effective and accountable and transparent manner, you're probably also hitting the right people. You're not creating the backlash from the civilian population. You're not incurring the wrath of the CNN effect. You're going to be more effective. Supports other lines of operation, obviously. There's a strong nexus between the rule of law efforts and compliant efforts and efforts to support governance institutions and economic institutions. And I think last is this idea that soldiers are maybe not the best people to fight counterinsurgency, that if you look at the various types of forces that you might need to deploy in an effective counterinsurgency situation, and you look at some of the historical case studies that we all like to band about, it's not the soldiers who win the day, it's the police. It's those institutions of civil society that enforce the law and discipline offenders and gather information from the people in an effective and transparent and accountable way. They're the ones that, over the course of years and decades, are the ones that really secure the environment and do so in a long-term manner. And so, again, to focus on military force and to exclude the law as a kind of mode of operation or as a kind of element of national power, I think is mistaken. I guess the bottom line, to put in a bumper sticker, would be that lawfare is good. Lawfare is a kind of conflict the U.S. can win because of its comparative advantages in this area, but the U.S. has to do more to get better at it, and the U.S. has to conceptualize of it in this way and really think of how it can affirmatively wage lawfare in a way that it really hasn't done to date. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this, and I now look forward to hearing Al describe how it works in practice.
Thank you. First, let me tell you that I'm speaking from a personal perspective. I'm a military officer who's worked for the past 7 years, approximately, on military rule of law support to civil efforts around the globe. As a disclaimer, I'm not an expert on policy or strategic matters, and in fact, because I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not in my U.S. Army capacity, I'll probably leave those issues to my colleagues to the right here. The final disclaimer I'll put in there is that if I'm going to be speaking specifically about things in Afghanistan, many of you who've been there, the folks that have been there as civilians and those in uniform know that things are very dynamic in any complex situation, whether it's Africa or South Asia or elsewhere. And so every piece of information that I have has a date time group as far as accuracy. It's my personal belief that the rule of law efforts that we're doing in Afghanistan, although many will criticize them as efforts at nation building and that they take us away from the main goal of dismantling and defeating Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, actually are critical to the effort of the United States and to the international alliance in defeating the Afghan insurgency and defeating the conditions or establishing conditions that will enable us to view Afghanistan as a success in the years down the road. The bottom line in the specific area that I worked in, I was in a series of commands that dealt with Afghan government capability, building the capacity of the Afghan justice sector in order to help their government to more effectively meet the needs of their people. At the end, I was a member of the Rule of Law Field Force, which was the U.S. command with the mission of working with the justice sector. And then we later received a NATO status as the NATO Rule of Law Field Support Mission, again to work with those same justice ministries. And I think that hopefully you'll find at the end of my remarks that, that you see some information that will enable you to understand why it was important in terms of defeating the greater insurgency and their goals. The first thing I want to speak about is what is the NATO Rule of Law Field Support Mission. The second thing I'll discuss is what did we do while we're in Afghanistan and what are they continuing to do. And then finally, why is this important for the counterinsurgency? The NATO Rule of Law Field Support Mission, which has an acronym that we in the military love to render as Enrolfsum. It's almost like a Nordic word that you can't pronounce. Is a military command that was created to be multifunctional and to engage the Afghan government to enable it to build its capacity to serve the justice needs of the nation. The first commander was Brigadier General Mark Martins, and he stood up the command. I worked for him for the time that we were in Afghanistan until last month. The current commander who's now taken over is Rear Admiral James Crawford, who just recently came from the position as the Chairman's Legal Counsel for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The command was created in July of 2011 as a NATO command, but prior to that it existed as a U.S. command from September of 2010. So from September of 2010 to September of 2011, we worked very hard at meeting a need that all of the nations that were part of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan saw as a critical need. The need to help build the civil government capability of the government of Afghanistan to work in the justice sector. These included the ministries of justice, the Supreme Court and its subordinate court system, the prosecutor's office that fell under the Attorney General, the law enforcement investigative capabilities in the Ministry of Interior, and the National Directorate of Security. All of these ministries and a number of other smaller organizations within the Afghan government were the key partners that we worked with in the Enrolfsum. What was our purpose? Our purpose was to provide leadership and overwatch. These were the words that General Petraeus used in our organizational documents, to military support to what was inherently a civilian-led effort. We had a lean headquarters and support structure that worked throughout the country. We were based in Kabul and Kandahar, but we had field teams in almost every sector of the nation of Afghanistan. I led all of the teams that were in the eastern provinces, so I had 14 of the 34 Afghan provinces where I supervised teams operating at provincial and district level. What did the organization consist of in the field teams? The field teams were the real meat of the Enrolfsum, the NATO Rule of Law Field Support Mission. Our teams were primarily multidisciplinary groups. If you're familiar with provincial reconstruction teams or with civil affairs teams, very similar in concept. You bring together a bunch of different experts who have different backgrounds, and you throw them at a very complex problem set and say, we want you to be able to figure out what the problem is and to craft locally appropriate solutions in the justice sector. And again, we focus solely on the justice sector, but we worked very closely with our provincial reconstruction team and civil and military operations partners in the civil affairs community. Because when you work with justice officials, you have to work with the executives at the provincial and district level. You have to work with financial and economic experts, and you have to work with those in civil society organizations who are working on the economic welfare and the capabilities of the population as a whole. What is it that we did? There were a number of things that we focused in on. We were primarily dealing with providing security to enable civilian-led rule of law building efforts. So we were like BASF. How many of you remember the television commercials by BASF where they said, we don't make the skateboard, we help to make it stronger? So we brought security and coordinated security to enable civilian experts from the Justice Department, from the Department of State, from the international community, the United Nations, to be able to get to the critical locations where they could work with provincial and district officials where otherwise they would be afraid to go because of the security situation and the insurgent threats. We ensured field coordination. So like many others, we helped to make sure that we bridged the gap in speaking with local military commanders who were busy fighting the insurgent fight, busy whacking moles, some would say, and sometimes thought less about how to enable a civilian aid worker to be able to get to a provincial headquarters than how do I attack the next insurgent or terrorist node. We helped to provide movement support. Again, logistics capabilities. We were able to leverage battlefield owners of the trucks and the convoys and the other elements that were necessary to make that happen. We helped to arrange air movement of government officials to be able to fly from their offices in Kabul and meet with their counterparts that they were supposed to be supervising at provincial and district level. Otherwise, they would have to drive themselves, and you know that in an insurgent environment, they're not particularly keen about putting their lives at risk driving into potential Taliban checkpoints. So we would help the Afghan government officials to do their jobs. We provided engineering support, and many people think that all we were was a building program. In fact, we viewed our primary effort as building that human capacity that we spoke about in the first three elements. Secondarily, we would do engineering support as necessary to provide a catalyst to building the human capacity or the ministerial capacity. We also worked, when it was necessary for construction contracting, to do contracting in a way that was a little different from what we had traditionally seen in military efforts in Afghanistan. Too often we had so many contracts that were let, but then were forgotten. So we had a systemic approach to providing construction contracting that did a number of things. One, we helped to supervise it from soup to nuts. We helped to ensure that we did it in a way that didn't help foster corruption and empower local warlords or other power brokers in the area, but instead helped to empower the people and their government officials in an appropriate manner. Finally, the thing that we brought to the table was we brought multifunctional experts to oversee a project from beginning to end as a program management solution. Too often, in our own structure in the military, we would have a contract office that all they cared about was the paper correct? Was it properly funded? And then at the end of it, did we cut a check properly? And there was no one that was going out to the building site to ensure that the insurgents weren't starting to affect the construction crews. That the way that we did major building projects engaged the local community and gave them a stake in the local building process. And so those are the kinds of major things that we did as we helped building the human and ministerial capacity of the justice sector. Well, how did that help in the counterinsurgent effort? The real question is, in your minds, what is the major goal that we have in countering an insurgency? Is it to defeat and to target kinetically insurgent groups that are hiding among the people? Or is it, more importantly, the goal of empowering the Afghan government to do its own business, to take care of the needs of its own people, and thus convince the people that they're worth supporting, that the people are it's worth their effort to get off the fence and to support the elected officials or the appointed officials who are working for them, providing them with public welfare, justice services, security, or other efforts. And I would argue that that is probably the more important goal in a counterinsurgency. And it definitely was in Afghanistan, as we saw. Why was this helpful in countering the insurgency? We as a military command, again, using the BASF approach, didn't come in and say, we're here to build your justice sector. We'll teach your judge how to do the judge's business in resolving your local disputes and in dealing with insurgents or other criminals that threaten law and order in your government or in your area. We were a military organization that deferred to the civil lead. And so that was a critical element of why people viewed us as less threatening and why they accepted our participation. It wasn't us coming in and telling them how to do things. It was us enabling them to achieve the things that they wanted to have in their own community. Again, the other element was our focus was on the Afghan officials. Time and time again, what we saw were Afghan officials that we helped the minister in Kabul to in place at a province or a district level, and that was the first government official from that ministry that ever set foot in that district. Time and time again, we helped them to conduct their first murder trial in a particular district that had never before seen central government activity or support. And all of a sudden, people are seeing their Afghan officials doing the business that we expect of government officials in our own country or in any country, coming down to the district level and meeting the needs of the people, whether it's a murder trial, whether it's resolving long-standing land disputes, or whether it's adjudicating family disputes that had arisen to community interest. The third thing that we did was that we focused on criminal justice efforts. Why did we do that? Well, one, it had a clear nexus to security. Because if you have the government that utilizes law enforcement capability and security expertise of the law enforcement agencies, you link them up with the prosecutors who are supposed to be trying those who commit offenses against the state or against the people, and you enable them to present cases to the judges who are in the judiciary, and then at the end of it, if a criminal trial ended in imprisonment, that you worked with the jails and the prisons officials to ensure that they were doing things in an appropriate manner, then you were focusing on an area of governance that many people viewed as the sole province of government. In Afghanistan, a tribal society, minor disputes, economic disputes, minor land disputes that haven't risen to the level of a critical threat to local security can often be handled by tribal institutions, or shuras or jirgas. But in Afghanistan, the people would often say, crimes like murder are the sole province of the government. If they can't resolve that, then how can we trust them to resolve any other matters that are of governmental importance? And so that's why we focused in on that, on criminal adjudication, because it was an area that was critical in the eyes of the people. It's also an area that was achievable, and there was a lot of interest among the U.S. government agencies and international organizations to work in that area. And so we thought this is an area that we could achieve change and positive efforts in. We also helped to increase access to dispute resolution services. One of the secondary benefits of working with the judiciary and the other officials that we did was they were now in the districts and available to adjudicate land dispute issues, or in some cases, economic issues like problems in the marketplace, in the local economy. What we found time and again, the prosecutors that we would help to bring down from Kabul were asked by local tribal leaders, because they were seen as not corrupt, they were seen as educated, and they were seen as neutral in their adjudication of issues. They were often asked to help resolve issues that were outside of the jurisdiction of the criminal prosecution role that they had. But because they were seen as government officials who could help the people, they were made available now, because we brought them as criminal justice experts, to resolve family, land, property, or other issues in the area. And it helped to enhance the legitimacy of the Afghan government there. So based on all this, I hope I've given you a glimpse into the tactical level, as Mr. Carter said, of how you can do military support to U.S. government and international efforts in an insurgency that has an effect on the security situation, that does have an effect on helping to achieve the interests of the United States. And that, in our case, was clearly to set the conditions so that the Afghan government would be stable and was on a track so that we could, upon transition in 2 or 3 years from now, be able to hand it over to the Afghan government and help ensure a scenario where we would not face a continued threat from Al-Qaeda or others who otherwise would use an ungoverned space known as Afghanistan as a basis for operations, as a basis of training, in order to threaten the United States in the future.
Very good, thank you. Well, we succeeded in